Welcome to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach, a podcast that unpacks international trade and how it affects you without putting you to sleep.
Welcome to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach. I'm Lori Wallach. Today, we're going to discuss an element of President Trump's trade and tariff threats that have gotten less attention. Those are attacks on Europe's online privacy protections and AI oversight and competition policies. It seems Trump is speaking on behalf of America's big tech monopolists. And today we're very lucky to have with us Kristina Irion. She's an associate professor at the Institute of Information Law at the University of Amsterdam. She's globally recognized for her research on European digital and data law and how so-called digital trade protections can threaten and undermine those consumer safeguards, as well as create problems with oversight of algorithms. We're also very lucky to have with us Rethink Trade's research director, Daniel Rangel, who has written many interesting analyses of how these digital trade rules affect U.S. law and policy, including recently an excellent new paper revealing that the U.S. Congress and U.S. government agencies and many U.S. states are now enacting some laws on privacy and on other data oversight concerns like security that are finally having us catch up to where the European Union has been. That paper shows digital trade rules that could undermine U.S. law. So let's start out with having Kristina just set the scene for us to describe at a high level what the European approach has been with respect to big tech, particularly about data and data flows.
Thank you for the kind introduction and greetings from Amsterdam. I am indeed specialized in the interface between EU regulation of digital and data, and it is a lot. Yeah, we have quite a intense regulatory framework now, which has been catching up with the challenges that the EU has faced and in protecting European values, fundamental rights, consumer rights, and also transparency, non-discrimination, and so forth. You may recall that we started all with the General Data Protection Regulation coming into force in 2018, which has been setting a very high standard for the protection of individuals' personal data, including also regulating cross-border data flows. And I would like to stress that it wasn't make it impossible to transfer data abroad, but it was making it conditional on ensuring a high level of data protection even once it has left the European Union. And with the US, we have always maintained most of the time a framework like the Privacy Shield, the Safe Harbor, and now the Transatlantic Data Protection Framework, which allows data flows between the EU and the US. And over time, we have added additional regulatory frameworks. For example, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act are two very important new legislative frameworks which focus on regulating and correcting the power of very large online platforms, among others. They are not specifically targeting US online platforms, but the bigness of it. So every platform that will reach the threshold, which is calculated by the number of subscribers, 10% of all users in the European Union, if they are subscribed on a large online platform, then these regulations will kick in. So it is a power-related regulatory framework that we know already from competition and antitrust law, but it is ex ante. So it basically applies without that there first needs to be an infringement. We also try to come to terms with the value of data for the new digital economy. So we have passed the Data Governance Act and the Data Act, and the EU is constructing something that is called data spaces. In all of this, also, you need to deal with data flows. So the main point here is that data flows are beneficial, especially when it's about communication, like making this podcast. But when it is about harnessing and creating value from data, it is sometimes useful to first bundle the data in one place, make a governance arrangement where companies, firms, but also individuals are happy to share their data. and then allow the use of this data to extract value from this data. And that is then not anymore exclusive. So we have to talk more about how to make the value of data, value creation from data possible. And for that, you need good data governance arrangements. Without data governance arrangement of this kind, data still flows, but it flows in rather unstructured ways according to the logics of power of platforms, because they are creating environments where data travels to them, but it doesn't create value for the society as a whole. So that is why data governance arrangements are useful. And yes, you can create a localization and boundaries for data and still allow the value of the data to be beneficial for companies in the EU, but also from abroad. And finally, we have the AI Act. This is also a very new piece of legislation that is rather voluminous, but the core of it is that it regulates, according to a risk-based approach, various tiers of artificial intelligence systems and generative AI. And only high-risk AI systems actually have to pass a market assessment test, but all the other AI systems can be introduced to the market without further ado. And an important aspect of this is, of course, that we want to have tools in place to protect individuals and also values, but in the end, to also allow AI to be penetrating our economies and societies. So it's about the balance.
Folks, think about when you go to Europe and you get on a website or you interface with a platform, and suddenly all these questions pop up about what you would like that platform to do with your personal data. That is the daily experience of Europeans, and not so much in the US, except the United States in the last number of years has started to also enact rules that put some constraints, limits on what the private sector can do with our data, personal data, but also bulk data. And so I'm going to ask Daniel, who's been looking into these US developments, to give us a little bit of an overview of some of the new US policies that limit flows of data and where data can be stored. And if anyone's wondering why the heck any of this has to do with a podcast about trade, stand by for the reveal. But first, Daniel, what's going on in the US?
Sure. Thanks, Laurie. Thanks for the question, and thanks for organizing the podcast, because I think this is a very timely topic. And along with what Kristina was describing in the robust, if you will, data governance ecosystem that we're seeing in Europe, we're starting to see that US policymakers, both at the federal and state level, are increasingly concerned about how data flows, where it is stored, and how it is handled, and particularly for security and honestly geopolitical reasons. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of recent policies. The first policy, the Protecting Americans' Data from Foreign Adversaries Act, which was passed in 2024 unanimously by the House and was included in a package at the Senate that was also passed and signed into law by President Biden then. And this law basically forbids data brokers from transferring American sensitive personal data to entities that are based or controlled by countries of concern, so China, Russia, North Korea. This came out of a really concerning documentation of how Chinese entities, for instance, affiliated with the government, have been able to buy data, bulk data on military personnel, like for instance, like where do they go? When do they go to the gym? And that's a kind of problem that US policymakers started to worry about and act on. But it's not totally recent trend. Since 2015, cybersecurity requirements for US government cloud computer contractors have been in place. And that has meant that since 2015, defense related data has to be stored in US servers, but even more recently, now those requirements are being expanded to other types of sensitive government data. And as I said, even policymakers at the state level are concerned about where data is flowing. So in 2023, Montana passed the Genetic Information Privacy Act, and this law basically bans the storage of Montana's genetic and biometric data in any country that has been sanctioned by the US federal government. And in California, in the same year, the Confidentiality of Medical Information Act was amended. And what this did was to mandate in state storage of sensitive medical information that is related to both reproductive health and gender affirming care.
Okay, so it sounds like, shocker, the US is doing some of the same kind of things that Trump administration is thinking of attacking the Europeans for. Better late than never to start thinking about what happens with our data. Now, where is the trade twist in all of this? Daniel, you just released a report, which I understand Kristina made very helpful insights on, that lays out conflicts between rules that the big tech lobby wants to put into trade agreements and both the privacy oriented, public interest oriented focus of the Europeans' rules on data flows and the US focus on security related concerns. Can you give us a high level overview of what those rules are?
Happy to. And I think that here we need to start, like we start with a lot of trade discussions, with the Trans Pacific Partnership, which was this big deal that was sponsored by the Obama administration. And there was a very deliberate push by the big tech lobby to include rules that have not been included in trade deals before. And they're often called cross border data flows rules or location of computing facilities rules. But basically, what these terms do is place very strict limits on how governments can regulate where data is stored and how it can move from one country to another one. And those rules got included in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Then the other countries started adopting different versions of the rules. The EU had a very long discussion about that Kristina was part of. So I would love for Kristina to share the story on the European side of this. But in the US, the next stage in which these rules were included were the US Mexico Canada Agreement. This was the renegotiation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And it was focused about the labor terms of the agreement, the environmental consequences of the deal, the rules of origin, how it could affect the auto industry. Honestly, there wasn't a lot of discussion about digital trade. Basically, we have in the USMCA two rules. One is called cross-border data flows, and the other one is called location of computing facilities that ban how governments can regulate international data transfer and if governments can establish certain requirements on where data can be stored or not. And if we compare those terms with, for instance, the European model or what some South American nations have been doing, we see that this model is really, really expansive and is way more far-reaching than the terms that have been negotiated by other agreements. Basically, the USMCA rules ban any kind of regulation that could affect data transfers from one country to the other one. And they also ban any kind of requirements for data to be stored in a country. And as I said earlier, well, now we have all of these policies that do exactly that in the US context. So there's a conflict there that we hope that the new administration realizes, because probably this wasn't the case back in 2018 and 2019 when these rules were negotiated, but now we are in a different world. And it's important to bear in mind the current state of US policymaking before going back to the table and try to push these deals in other agreements potentially.
So, Kristina, the European Union has a bunch of trade agreements, some of which have digital rules. We're hearing from Daniel that the USMCA has really stark constraints on any oversight of data flows or where data is kept. What's been the European approach in their trade agreements?
The European Union is negotiating on behalf of its 26 member states international trade law. And the Commission has a unit only doing international trade. And they also very much delighted about this new field, digital trade. And they were seeing what's happening elsewhere. And they were like really embracing it right in the beginning. And they were also willing to negotiate free cross-border data flow clauses with third countries and to engage in a ban on the disclosure of source code of software of parties of another member and so on. So there was a lot of enthusiasm. And we have then started working as scholars, but also with civil rights organizations about trying to cross basically what digital trade law requires a country or the EU to do and what our own regulatory framework already says. And we figured out that at least with the general data protection regulation that there is a conflict. And now the interesting spin is who has a conflict in which direction, yeah? Often it is said that the GDPR doesn't comply with international trade rules, but you could also see it a different way, and you could say international trade rules don't comply with the GDPR. So in a way, we were able to show and convince also the negotiators of the European Union that the way how they inscribe data flow arrangements into these trade law agreements, that this would actually create a conflict with the GDPR, and that is something that ought to be avoided. And so they have adopted a distinct strategy, different to what the US and other countries are doing. So they have now a very robust exception for regulation that is in the name of protecting individual data and privacy. So only for this, there is now an exception that kind of counterbalances this commitment that they are still undersigning on cross-border data flows. However, we have also discussed in the beginning already that we are increasingly having cross-border data flow restrictions in order to achieve good data governance. And again, I believe that the framing of free data flows is very attractive, obviously. It sounds like a very good concept, like free flow of ideas, free flow of communications. These are good things. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. But if you want to achieve that data can be used for good purposes in the interest of society, it can be well managed, it accumulates because there's trust to give data by that firms would like to give their data to a data space, that individuals don't mind that their data is used for data science, for AI training, and so on. You need to create a framework that actually also protects the interests of these firms, of the data holders, of the individuals. And with such a framework, you cannot just say everybody can tap into this data space and exploit all this data somewhere else. So you need to reside this data space in the jurisdiction of the European Union. But, and that is actually where the logic of trade law fails to recognize that it is not a conflict, because everybody can be allowed to use this data space. So it doesn't discriminate when it is about value creation. It does just not allow this whole data space to be copied and be moved to other places. And that in relation with guaranteeing the rights and also the arrangements of this data governance in this space. And so while not all the data can flow from the data space, the value from this data space can flow. So what do we need to flow is the question. Yeah, every piece of data so that it archaically accumulates in very large online platforms and big tech, or do we want to have well curated data spaces where there is valuable and large amounts of data that are well maintained, that are accurate, you can work with them and you make it available to many players, big and small. They can tap into this data space and they can process data and generate value like this. Also when they are from third countries. So this is actually a smart and clever solution, which trade law, when it just focuses on the flow of data, would actually forgo. And it would only give the data game to those companies that are able to create environments where data automatically gets stuck like large platforms.
So that sounds pretty good, but shocker, the big tech companies hate that idea because right now they have total control and can do whatever the hell they want. So right now, the big tech lobbyists are playing a really cynical game. They have labeled that special interest set of demands Daniel described as the digital trade rules as part of a trade agenda, and they're trying to appeal to Trump's convictions that the United States has been abused on trade by other countries. So they've got this rhetoric that Trump has started to repeat about our Facebook and Google and Apple being treated unfairly in other countries. It's like they hope that President Trump doesn't realize that his demands to weaponize trade policy against the Europeans would and could boomerang back against the federal and state policies in the US that Daniel was just describing. But it seems that they're making a little progress because 2 weeks ago, the administration issued a memo that suggested that European and other countries' regulations of data and other big tech oversight should be investigated as potential legal trade barriers. And what the tech lobbyists are trying to do is reverse what happened during the Biden administration, where the US government stepped back and suddenly realized, wait 1 minute. Are these old big tech rules, the digital trade rules we put in USMCA, are those actually fit to purpose now that the US is starting to regulate some of these issues too? And so the Biden administration put on the emergency brake, said, not so fast. We're not going to actually continue to push that stuff. And now the big tech lobbyists want the US to basically restore their agenda. And so the White House issued a, quote, directive to prevent the unfair exploitation of American innovation, which lists things like data flow rules as potential illegal trade barriers. Now, as Daniel just said, it seems pretty improbable that President Trump would, in an informed way, choose to subordinate US sovereignty to trade agreement dictates, much less expose state and federal law or executive branch actions, for that matter, to international preemption by trade pacts. But the question is, does he really know what it is he's setting himself up to do? I mean, when he was nominating Gail Slater to lead the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, he put on Truth Social, quote, big tech has run wild for years, stifling competition in our most innovative sector. And we all know using its market power to crack down on the rights of so many Americans, as well as those of little tech. He sounds a little bit like, I don't know, Lena Khan. So which way is it going to go? And what will happen if the administration attacks the European Union, threatens it with tariffs, unless it rolls back those policies that Kristina's been describing? So, Kristina, what do you think is going to happen? Does Trump tariff bullying on the EU on these data policies make the European resolve stronger to hold on to those policies? Or is there some chance this could lead the European Union to cave?
This is very fascinating development, and we are also watching to the European Commission in whether they are showing any impact of the US developments. So I think there's more resolve actually on part of the European Commission, given that also the European Union has a right to regulate and set standards in order to achieve important public interest goals. Think, for example, of data protection, privacy, consumer protection, fairness, and transparency, but also creating a level playing field with smaller companies in the digital markets. So all of these objectives, they are notable and they are important, and they seek to balance out a regulatory framework where big and small can coexist. And I don't believe that the pressure from the United States will actually achieve that the European Union will back down and will stop enforcing the laws that it has already passed, or take on a more light approach to regulatory enforcement. In fact, what I believe what can happen is that it will actually be water on the mills of those who are preaching for more digital sovereignty, and to actually reduce the dependence on on US big tech companies, given that these are not reliable partners for us, because these are partners who want to one-sidedly set the rules of the game and do not respectfully treat other countries' regulatory autonomy. So in a way, it could really backfire as well.
So we're going to all see how this plays out, attacking these European data policies that the US is going to target with tariffs. We will see whether the big tech lobbyists have made some breakthroughs trying to revive a policy that basically conflicts with both what Trump has said about big tech and what Trump believes on trade. Entirely possible, but not certain. If you want to know more about this, I want to just have Daniel flag a couple of really great resources that he helped develop that can show everyone exactly what is at stake here in the US.
So at Rethink Trade, we have been doing a lot of research about all of these potential conflicts between trade law and the digital policies that policymakers are adopting both in the US and elsewhere. So I urge you to take a look at the report. We explore all of these questions regarding data privacy, but also how the data sharing mandate could be a barrier to trade under the jargon of big tech. Actually, they say that themselves. There's a statement from the Chamber of Commerce going after the EU Data Act, saying that the data sharing mandates are a restriction of the movement of data. Um, there's also an interesting resource in our website that flags how there are over 100 bills and policies at the state level in the US that could be conflicting with these digital trade rules.
And if folks want to take a look at the details behind this cynical big tech lobby move on Trump, check out my piece in Compact Magazine online, The Digital Trade Trap. Please check out our website, as Daniel suggests, www.Rethink Trade, for all you need to know on the impacts of these issues on your day-to-day lives by looking up whether your state has passed laws that could be sacked under these rules, and also to understand what these data security rules mean practically for you and for your security and your data. Thank you very much, both to Kristina, what wonderful expertise to have. Really appreciate you joining us. And Daniel, both of you for all of your great work on these issues. And listeners, stay tuned. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach. Until next time.